Okay. Thanks everyone for joining today. So it's a great pleasure to have we have our very own Dave Lawrence today, visiting from NCAR. He's a senior scientist and section head of the land working group at NCAR. Has been doing a lot of amazing work on CLM, the community land model, like looking at a lot of developments and making a lot of great science there. He was interim director at NCAR until very recently. CGD, yeah. CGD, yeah.
Order of magnitude.
Yeah, order of magnitude. Yeah, and we are very much looking forward to your talk. So he's been doing a lot of interesting work on basically model development within the community land model and the community or system model. And there's been a lot of development these days at NCAR trying to look at, especially related to LEAP at parameter inference and parameter tuning, and how can we and can we even do that automatically? So very much looking forward to it. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So thanks. Yeah, it's fun to be here. It's fun to, after how many years, 3+ years of LEAP, to actually come finally visit at Columbia, getting ready. And so I really enjoyed, working within the LEAP project. And so I'm going to get the chance for the first time throughout this project to actually talk about the work that we're doing, as opposed to like the bigger CSM picture. And I realized that I didn't change the title from a previous talk, so I don't have the word parameter estimation in the title, which is what this will be about. But the actionable science part is part of this presentation. So this is adapted. And as always, work is done by a lot of different people. In this case, I really want to thank Daniel Kennedy, Katie Dagon, and Lydia Hawkins. Lydia Hawkins is a postdoc who's working in LEAP, and Daniel and Katie are project scientists at NCAR who work with me. And I've kind of moved into this career stage where I'm not doing hardly anything, and so really they're the ones doing all the work, and so I'm actually having to get used to me presenting other people's work. That's the way it goes. But they did all the work, and in a lot of ways put together a lot of the presentation as well. So kudos to them. Okay, so big picture, climate science is in transition, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion. We're moving away from, and this is LEAP. I'm telling you guys what you've already heard. LEAP is getting this space. So we've known now for a long time that climate change is happening. We've proven with our Earth system models how much climate change is going to happen under different scenarios of emissions. So the question is no longer, is climate change happening or going to happen? It's really changed to the question of, what are we going to do about it? And how is it going to impact people? So, to take climate-related action, people need to know how, where, and when humans and ecosystems are going to be exposed to hazards. So this is the LEAP reason for being here, is to understand how we're going to adapt using our system science to understand we're going to adapt. And then we have to ask, to what extent can we reliably predict these changes on a range of time and spatial scales? And additionally, and as there's this big meeting tomorrow with the business community in New York, there's a lot more stakeholders now who are interested in climate information, climate analytics companies coming up all over the place. So it's in transition. And I was organizing a workshop last fall called the Land Surface Modeling Summit, where we got all the Earth system modeling land groups together to talk about how we could advance our models faster to be able to address these questions. And at the end of the meeting, we had this sort of the summary meeting, which I was organizing meetings. So I thought I sort of don't like those things at the end of the meeting where you're trying to say what the next steps are. So I'm like, okay, we're going to write a boring synthesis paper about all the needs for land models and to address these questions. And somebody said, come on, let's stop that. Really, what it is, we need to save the world. We're patting ourselves on the back that we land modelers are going to save the world. Every community is required to save the world. We think we're going to contribute to that. And the questions are big, right? We need to really address these questions. Will we have enough water, right? Order one fundamental question. It's not like who cares about parameter estimation. It's like, will we have enough water? Will we be able to produce enough food, right? That's the question. And we'll be able to produce that food sustainably. Where and when will people and ecosystems experience more extreme events? Order one question. And from the land side and the ocean side, where are we going to put the carbon? We need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere to reach our low climate change goals. Absolutely has to happen. There's no way we can reduce emissions fast enough or strong enough to do it without pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And the question is, if we can pull that carbon out of the atmosphere, will it stay there? there could be fire, there could be drought, there could be beetle kill. Because these are like order one, really fundamental questions we have to address. It's no longer like we just got to make incremental advances. We need to charge ahead very fast to be able to answer these questions. And there's a lot of ways to answer these questions, but a fundamental tool, as everyone in this room is fully aware, is Earth system models. They're often required to answer these big questions about the coupled Earth system. And the model is at the center of the project. It's the CSM, the Community Earth System Model, which is a model I've been working on developing over the course of the last 20 years or so. And it's obviously a complex model of the representation of the Earth system. And land is an important component of this. And I want to argue that land processes are going to be quite important to understand these actionable science, these mitigation, these adaptation questions. So there's a fundamental question: agricultural processes and land models important for understanding climate change. And I work at NCAR. We have all the Earth system scientists represented there. So we have, the running joke, the oceanographers are the most important, and they go, oh, it's just the land, doesn't matter. The atmospheric scientists do that too. And my wife happens to be an oceanographer. And so we have this conversation in the kitchen. She's like, why? Why do you exist? For lots of reasons. She asked me that, but one of them is scientifically. Are you sure this is really necessary? Okay, I respond. Of course, it's necessary. Land is a critical interface which humanity affects and is affected by, adapts to, and mitigates global environmental change. Humans live on the land. And also land is where the energy changes, the water changes that are being processed, which then control the near surface climate, which is what humans are being affected by. So, land is not going to necessarily control the big climate changes, but it's going to be really important to understand the impact on humans. I don't really need to make the argument here. We're all aware that this is like all a fully coupled interactive problem. And furthermore, in our community, people are getting more and more interested and able to represent humans in the system, so that we can ask these questions about adaptation and mitigation related to how humans are going to actually do those things. And so in CLM, we put a lot of effort in the last few years to include land management processes. So we have a global crop model, which represents 8 different, actually now 10 different crop types when we include biofuels. We treat irrigation, we treat fertilization, we account for wood harvest on land. Which is really important. The forests are producing the fiber that we need to build buildings. We have urban environments where humans live and where the climate change impacts are the strongest. And we represent anthropogenic fire ignition and suppression, which then allows us to study questions of fire. So we have these processes. So we think we have a model that can be used actionably. But one of the challenges is because if you take the model and move it into a location, or if you try to study a particular location, almost invariably, if you try to study, are the heat waves properly represented in, someplace in India, the answer is going to be no, right? And so then people say, well, it's not useful for me because it's not accurate enough. And that's where we kind of get to this question of parameter estimation. I'll get you have to make this one more point. Here's another example of what we need to have an actionable model that we can use for adaptation. So the question, will we have enough water, in particular in the West, the Colorado River? Will we have enough water from the Colorado River going in the future? And obviously in the last few years, it's, the answer is looking like no. But if you ask whether or not Earth system models are able to help us answer this question, the answer to that is also unfortunately no. So this is a plot that showed on the y-axis is the runoff from the upper Colorado River. On the x-axis is precipitation change, or a precipitation amount for the basin. And what you see is the observations are here in the black line there at the bottom. So for a unit difference in precipitation for 1 year to the next, what is the difference in runoff you get from the in the observational vector? And so you see a slope there, and that kind of tells you, gives you some inference of what climate change would do if you had an increase in precipitation. Then you show what the models get. First of all, the models are really biased in precipitation. That's the first problem. A lot of models are showing way too much precipitation in this region. What we also see is that the slope is not the same. So that means that the hydrologic sensitivity, the runoff change you get for a unit change in precipitation is incorrect, which means that you can't just take the runoff straight out of the Earth system model and then use it to make projections in like a water management model if you wanted to. So that's a problem, right? This is not an actionable model. So these are the kind of things that we're trying to address through parameter estimation. Okay, so that brings me to to our effort. The community land model parameter coordination experiment. This is an effort that sort of preceded LEAP and then has been is being advanced by LEAP, and I'll get into that in a minute. But we're trying to quantify, the parametric uncertainty and work towards automated calibration so that we can have a model that we can then quickly bring into a new situation, a new science question, and be able to get it accurate enough to be able to, actionable science coming out of it. Okay, so the land model has grown in complexity quite substantially over the last 20 years since I've been involved and working at NCAR. And the comprehensiveness is also growing. So these are great. Like we have more science in here, we have more feedback, we have more interactions. It's more faithful to the real system. But coming along with that is a really dramatically increasing number of in a lot of ways, uncertain, in many cases, uncertain parameters. And so what on the right there shows, the complex set of energy, water, and biochemical cycles that are representing the model. On the bottom indicates landscape scale processes like transfers, land use change, and considering urbanization and things like that, and how rivers connect water across the landscape. So CLM 5, the version we're currently using is CSM 2. And the biochemical version, which is the most comprehensive version, has over 200 parameters. That's an intense number of parameters. And in fact, it's even worse than that because about 30 of those parameters are what we call plant functional type parameter. And we have 17 plant functional types in the model, plus another 8 that are crop types. So you multiply that 30 parameters with your Ph.D. parameters times 17, add that to 200, and we're getting up to something like 400, 500 parameters in the model. So it's an intense parameter space, which quite hard to manage. And I just want to tell a story here about the development of CSM2, which I used in a presentation I gave when I was fortunate enough to get the CSM Distinguished Achievement Award for building CLM5. And the point I was making here is we started off with a model. This is the additions to the model for CLM4, which is the model using CSM1. I'm not going to go through them. They're adding processes, allow us to ask different questions about permafrost and carbon and nitrogen cycles. We had a bicycle, the analogy there, a bicycle that had some stuff on it, but it could still move. As we moved to CLM 4.5, an interim version on our path to CSM2, we added a whole bunch of additional new things, all again, trying to build a more comprehensive representation of your system. The bicycle is getting more loaded down. And by the time we got to CLM5, the community had grown. We're adding a whole bunch more things, including stuff coming out of Pierre's group. And we found at that time when we were trying to put them all together for CSM2, that we essentially couldn't control it. We couldn't get it into a configuration that was giving reasonable results, even though the physics, the new biochemistry was all like founded in good foundations. When you put it all together, we were not getting good simulation results. And part of that was, the CLM development teams successfully integrated this big pile of CLM5 developments, research community, but all these new uncertain parameters, especially related to the plant hydraulics coming out of Pierre's group, related to nutrient cycles, new parameters which were not well constrained in the literature, not well constrained by observations. And several things are happening. One of the things that was happening is that we were finding that in significant fraction of the parameter space, plants were not surviving through spin up. So we have a relatively complex process to get the model carbon cycle spun up, soil carbon, vegetation carbon stays spun up in the pre-industrial conditions. And it takes a long time. It would take a week basically to spin the model up each time. And what we were finding is that we make our best guesses on parameters. We run the model and we find that large fraction had not survived through the spin up. And so what this plot shows here, everything that's in purple means that it didn't live. So this particular needle deciduous boreal tree, it's called a larch tree. Everywhere that's its domain, essentially wasn't living anywhere, wasn't surviving. In the tropics, this broadleaf deciduous tropical tree was only surviving in the deep tropics, where it's actually a broadleaf evergreen tree is the ones that actually live there. The ones that are supposed to be living in the Sahel weren't surviving spin up. So this was a problem. We couldn't come up with a configuration of the model. So we said, okay, we have Ben Sanderson was our scientist there. He's anyone who knows him, I'm not sure who would know him, but he's an extremely smart guy. He's one of all of you are going to be, who has the data science knowledge, the machine learning knowledge. He's like, I can solve your problem. I'm very, very smart. And we all agreed you're very, very smart. So he's like, I'm going to come in, we're going to, parameter optimization by machine learning. And we got 3 months to solve this problem. Okay, so that we were totally naive. We're like, okay, this can happen. Many attempts, every time. new parameter set. This one's going to be perfect. You guys are going to have the best model ever. Nothing survives spin up. Another 2 weeks. More ideas. Try again. We went through 4 or 5 cycles because we can't do that many because it takes a long time. Meanwhile, we said, okay, if Ben doesn't succeed, we do need to have a backup plan. So the rest of us, myself and Rosie Fisher and a bunch of other experts were like painfully like hand tuning. Like, I think it looks like if we had a little bit lower nutrient limitation, we'd do a little better in the Arctic, and we'd like try that out. And it was terrible. It was like scaring its confusion. It was miserable. And I was also involved in that. I was also running interference with our chief scientist. He was like, where is your model? Where is your model? Where is your model? So this is the little joke I did when I got this award, the reenactment. So it was January 25th, 2017, a reenactment because this was during COVID times. So the scene, we were desperately trying to finalize CSM2 in order to take advantage of the Cheyenne Yellowstone overlap. So those are our supercomputers, and we had the new supercomputer was coming online, and we were going to run all our CMF simulations, which is like many, many millions of core hours on Yellowstone in a little period of time we had overlap. So we had this window, right, to do everything. So multiple extensions, and they said, give us one last weekend to sort out our parameter problem. Otherwise, we'd have to revert back to CLM 4.5, which was working. But that was like taking 5 years of people's effort, right? I was gonna have to throw it. I was gonna have to go back to the community and say, we failed all your work. Sorry, Pierre, out the window. Okay, so so on the Friday before the weekend, Steve Olson, our lead sort of tech guy, set up 2 new spin-ups, one with the latest of Ben's many attempts, and one with our best hand-tuned parameters. On Monday morning, 6:45 a.m., we both get in the office super early, and like Keith comes into my office and shows me the results of ML calibrated parameters, mainly dead plants. Didn't work, another iteration. I said, that's okay, it's okay, we got a backup, we got a new backup, a really confidence backup, check the other parameter set, the hand-tuned one. 10 minutes later, he says, plants in the backup hand-tuned parameter are not surviving either. Uh-oh. So this is my reenactment. I actually was in my office. This is my home office. I closed the door, my head on the table. I considered a resignation letter. I was really like, what am I going to do? 30 minutes later, Keith writes back and says, scratch that, plug in my code, analysis code, backup parameter set. That's great. My bad. Okay, so that's not sustainable, right? We can't survive it emotionally. We can't survive it from a real world perspective. We need something better. Hand tuning just isn't going to work anymore. It's difficult to diagnose structural improvements. It's challenging to incorporate new parameterizations. If you have to hand tune every time, it's impractical, requisite knowledge base. I mean, none of us were there, had enough experience to know which parameter to tune in each aspect of the model. And it doesn't scale with increasing complexity, right? This is just going to keep getting worse and worse. It's a whack-a-mole problem. The second big motivation is we don't really know what contribution that parameter uncertainty is having on the overall uncertainty of the system. There's been a few studies related to this, but really it's not really quantified. And the right shows this sort of canonical figure from CMF 5 actually about showing the land carbon uptake over into the future. And it's big. The spread across this is all the CMF model. The spread is intense. It's actually equivalent to 60 years of fossil fuel emissions. So essentially, we're getting very little useful information from the land and our understanding of how much carbon is going to be taken up. And that's really important because that tells us how much our permissible emissions are to get to a certain climate target. So if we're not accurate here, we have no real sense of what our emissions need to be. And it's a big signal. It's about a third of the overall total climate uncertainty. Much of the rest is coming from clouds. So we don't know how much is coming from parameter uncertainty and structural errors. And the third one is like what I mentioned in the beginning. If we have the capability to tune these models quickly, then it's really increases accessibility for actionable science. And just on the right there, I'm listing the kinds of things that we'd like to be able to answer, but are finding it difficult to do because we can't get an accurate enough model. And another motivation, not really motivation, but it's an opportunity, is that there's really an unprecedented availability of Earth observations right now. I'm sure you guys are all aware of that. The number of satellite observations that are out there is intense now. It's hard to even keep up with all the new satellites that are going up. And a lot of them are giving us really detailed, interesting information about land processes. And then, of course, there's a network of tower sites around the country and around the world. There's the great new NEON data set, which is really robust data sets from tower sites with really rich array of data. There's LiDAR information that can tell us a lot of forest structure. There's just a lot more observations than there were even just a decade ago. And the last piece is that there's new integrated metrics packages that they're available. And this is a project called ILAM, International Land Model Benchmarking Project. It's a project I've been involved in with the DOE to build a metrics package that allows us to routinely evaluate diverse system models. And this seemed like an obvious thing to do, right? Why haven't we done this? But back when I was building CLM4, I literally, when we had to ask a question about how good is our gross primary productivity, a key variable in the model, we would sit around in a room, stare at maps, and go, looks about right. That was it. No observations, nothing. Just like, it seems reasonable. It's higher in the tropics than it is in the latitudes. That was all we had. Now with all this new data, we actually have the ability to go back and actually, develop metric packages. So this is a cool package where you have a graphics and scoring system for mean square error, bias, seasonal cycle phase, spatial patterns, incremental variability for 35 different land variables, 90 different global regional data sets. We can run this quickly. It takes a couple hours and we can run through. And this shows all the Earth system models across the top coming out of CMIP6. And then, here's the 35 plus variables. And each color here indicates how good your model is relative to the other models in that comparison. And it's actually a synthesis of all the scores that are coming from this different list here. So it's actually an interactive package where you can click in and go deep down and get a bunch of information layer by layer by layer through the model. So we have these packages, which then means we have the possibility to calibrate because we actually have enough information to potentially constrain the models. Okay, so our approach, it's a standard approach for calibration. Model calibration is not something new. Like people have been doing this for a long time. Hydrologists have done it for forever. It's relatively new in the Earth system model world, and the GIST team has done this recently, and you maybe heard it talk by them, but if you haven't, I'm sure you will soon. Have pretty successfully done it for the atmosphere model. And we are following the same methodology. It's not like we're coming up with a new methodology. They're just different challenges on land than there are in the atmosphere, and I'll get to those. So, you run an ensemble of simulations with parameter perturbations. You might run it with a Latin hypercube or some other method to sort of expand the parameter space. You define your metrics, one or more metrics. You do a machine learning emulation of those metrics based on the simulations with with all the parameters. You constrain the parameters, and then you optimize. Okay, so this is the standard approach that we're trying to do within CLM. And so after our failed attempt to do this for the CLM5 for CSM2, we took a step back and said, okay, we're going to do a bit more systematic. And so Katie Dagon, Ben Sender, and Rosie Fisher, and myself did an effort on a much smaller problem. So we worked with what we call the prescribed vegetation version of the model, prescribed satellite phenology version of the model. So we're not running with full biogeochemistry. So it's a much simpler problem. The model doesn't have a big spin-up problem. It runs fast. And the number of parameters is, less than half the number of parameters you have in the global. So we're able to show following that sort of cycle that we could do some calibration on the model. And so this shows on the bottom right here is the default CLM for GPP, growth primary productivity, of the default versus the optimized. And if you look carefully, you can see that there has been reductions in the bias for GPP. And if you actually look at the global mean bias, it's actually reduced substantially. What we also see is that, if you look really carefully, is that it only really improved in a few regions, particularly tropical Africa. In this place tended to be the place that improved. Much of the world actually got worse. In the Amazon is sort of debatable whether it got better or worse, better in some places, worse in others. The mid-latitudes, it's roughly the same. So, we kind of showed that we can get something better, but we didn't get to a point where like, this is a model we really feel is like a great representation of the Earth. So we learned a lot during that project. But what were we missing? Well, first of all, it was this satellite phenology version. So it's a simplified version. It's not the version we want to use for projections. So it's useful. We do use it quite a bit in our science, but it's not the full model which we use most often. It was also minimal sampling. We just did 6 parameters and 100 ensemble members, so it's a relatively small problem. Limited number of metrics that we're using. Decisions about that cost function were not properly accounting for uncertainty, and we can see that we didn't really properly account for regionality. And the choice of our calibration target was pretty limited to just carbon and water fluxes. So that's why we then initiated the CLM PPE project. So this required quite a bit of work. So we started this 2.5 years ago or so. And the first phase is what I'm calling infrastructure development. So we need a fast spin up. To deal with that spin up problem, we need to expose all the parameters. So when we started this project, about half of the parameters were hard coded in the model, which is obviously bad practice, but the model was developed 15, 20 years ago when people weren't thinking about this. So all the parameters had to even be identified. It's actually not even that easy to identify all the parameters. What's a parameter in the model? You actually have a lot of conversations about what is a parameter. You have to identify all the parameters, you have to pull them all of the code, you have to put in the necessary files. It takes real work. Identify parameter ranges for 200 plus parameters. Obviously, I can't identify parameter ranges for 200 plus parameters, so it took a whole team of people, experts, to find the parameters. And then you need to build an ensemble analysis scripting. And all those things are important. I think the real key one is the fast spin up, right? Until recently, it was computationally prohibitive. It took about 1,500 years for us to spin up CLM to equilibrium. That's a long simulation, right? There's no way you can run thousands of simulations when you have to do a 1,500-year simulation that takes over a week to run. It's just you need a lot of computer time, and it's also not possible in real time. So we did two things. First, we did a cluster analysis, and we were able to find that we could reasonably replicate the global response with only 400 grid cells, which is really helpful. So the land has a nice feature that it's not really dynamic in the sense grid cells do not interact with each other. So they're essentially a bunch of column models. And so you can actually do this. You couldn't do this in the ocean, it wouldn't work. You couldn't do this in the atmosphere, it wouldn't work. But on land, we can do this. So we can run with just 400 grid cells. And then we also have a matrix solution to spin up, which came out of Yi Chu Lo's group in Northern Arizona University, which allowed us to have a matrix solution, so basically mathematical solution to the spin up, which allowed us to much faster get the spin up and decrease by 10x. So overall, we had about a 200x increase in speed, which then made it tractable. We could actually spin up the model thousands of times reasonably. So then we did a one-at-a-time parameter ensemble, starting there to, it's 200 plus parameters, so we needed to constrain it somehow. We started with, and one thing we did, which is a little bit unique here, I think, that isn't, say, done in the hydrology community, is we ran a control, so in present-day climate and present-day CO2, one at a time. But we also ran the climate of 1850 and the future climate, and we also ran the CO2 of 1850 and the CO2 of the future climate, and we also ran with increased nutrient deposition. And this allowed us then to ask these questions, like, if you look at the low side parameters, especially, did the plants die? So we could then, before we even get started on a big Latin hypercube ensemble, constrict the parameter ranges so we weren't going to have a situation where a big fraction of the parameters died. And so then, we can, when you do that, okay, so I'm going to have a few things about why one at a time. Because, a lot of people go straight to Latin hypercube because that's where you get the parameter interactions and really understand what's going on. We did one at a time first because, first of all, there's 200 parameters. It's also an easy to interpret data set. So you can easily plot all 200 parameters, just see what is the effect of the min and the max value. And then for certain variables, right, we can screen variables out, right? And so screen parameters out. And so, for example, the leaf rate index, which is an important quantity, which I'll get to in a moment, about 140 of those parameters had no impact on LEI. So you can say we don't need to worry about those for parameter calibration. And doing a lot in hypercube of 200 plus parameters just didn't seem like it was going to be feasible. And also, it allowed us to ask these questions about response. When we ran these environmental perturbations, we can ask these questions about which parameters control the response to a perturbation. So this plot is here, the top 12 parameters, and I'm not going to tell you what they are. It doesn't really matter in this case, but for the CO2 fertilization effect. So not just the mean state, but actually the thing we often really care about most, which is how much are plants going to take up carbon under increased CO2. And so that's kind of a nice new feature of this, is that we can actually look at the parameter perturbation. And when you're doing a climate change problem, that's actually what you're trying to understand, is which parameters are going to control the response to a climate perturbation. So this is, I think, a nice way of demonstrating it. Which parameters control soil, water, 10 centimeter key variable model, hydrology parameters in the mean, hydrology parameters show up at the top. That's not surprising, but also plant parameters, which is also maybe not surprising when you think about it. Plants are controlling how much water is being used from the soil, and so it's not surprising that plant parameters end up being near the top of the list. If you look at the interannual variability, you see that it's actually mostly plant parameters which are controlling the interannual variability, which kind of makes sense because plants are the things that are varying interannually. The soil is not really varying interannually, soil texture, for example. And there's also other things like soil depth and organic matter. If you look at the response to CO2 fertilization, it's all plant parameters. And again, that makes sense because those plant parameters are the ones that would be controlling the CO2 impact on photosynthesis and water use. And then finally, in response to climate, you see some hydrology parameters, but you also see some acclimation parameters. So there's some equations in the model which account for acclimation of plants to changes in temperature. So plants slowly acclimate and start, if it kind of gets out of their normal range, they can adjust and still, produce well, even when it's slightly outside their range. So the acclimation parameters end up being important. So I just think this is interesting that, each response to perturbation yields a different set of parameters. And the reason this is important is if you're going to try to do, like a Latin hypercube, you're going to want to include those parameters that are controlling the response in your overall Latin hypercube, right? You don't want to just throw those out because if you're just trying to calibrate to a mean response, you're not going to be able to understand the full picture, climate change picture. The other nice thing that this one-at-a-time experiment allows us to do is to, evaluate which parameters matter across different biomes. And again, this is an interesting result, especially for land modelers. It says it's a different set of parameters that control, in this case, GPP, gross primary productivity, in a tropical rainforest than it is in boreal forest. In the tropical rainforest, it's the parameters that control plant water use. In the boreal forest, where there's less light, it's the parameters that control light use efficiency. So not surprisingly, the plants are sensitive to how light is used. And in the temperate grassland, it's the plants that control soil water availability. So that tells you how likely it is to be affected by drought. So none of this is surprising, but it's really interesting ability to probe the model and understand, is the model working right? If it hadn't lined up like this, it probably would have been a little bit disturbing, but fortunately it did. And then finally, in this point, what we're finding is a lot of people are really enjoying having this data set exist. And so Daniel Kennedy has built an interactive visualization tool so that you can go in and look at any of our top 20 variables and ask, what is the impact of Medland slope, for example, as a plant parameter on the total whatever variables. This is total LAI. So you can see, the change in Medland slope, in this case, how that had a decrease. And you can look at the spatial patterns of that. So you can go through and interactively. So I think that's going to be a resource that people are really going to use. And we're working on that. We'll include that in the publication. And in the sense of build it and they will come world, the CLM PP project has already initiated a whole bunch of spin-off projects. So just the fact that we created this one-at-a-time ensemble with all these different environmental perturbations, there's now 10 different groups around the world which are using this output to either start their own calibration effort, to use and understanding some aspect of the model there. So again, at NCAR, and I think within LEAP, the idea is to build things that are going to affect a bigger group than just the team that you're working with, right? And so that's what we try to do at NCAR for sure within CSM. And it's really, we're happy when we see this kind of things happen. So now for the last 10 minutes or so, I'll get into what LEAP is doing, where Linnea Hawkins came into the project. And so this is what we're calling phase 2. So we finished the infrastructure development, we finished the one-at-a-time parameter perturbations, and now we want to get into calibration, right? And understanding parameter interactions. So we're going to start off with decisions about how to define which parameters we should use for the Latin hypercube, the most important parameters. So obviously, when you're doing calibration, you have to decide what are you calibrating for, right? We have a lot of things we could calibrate for in a complex model like CLM, complex model like CAM, complex model like MOM. So we've identified what we call our 12 key variables, which we think there's observational constraints, and there's some potential that we can calibrate for. So that's a lot. Calibrating for 12 variables is going to be ambitious. I think they have done this to a certain degree in the GIST model with the atmosphere. I'm not sure how many variables they're calibrating for, but multiple variables. But we wanted to start off with more simply. We also want to, when we're trying to figure out which parameters to look at, we need to consider which are the most important parameters for a range of different things. So we can look at the global mean, come up with a list of parameters. We can look at the global interannual variability, come up with a list of parameters, look at the diurnal cycle, look at the biome level means, look at the response to perturbation. So we're kind of constructing our limited set of parameters so that it kind of has the ability to capture all these different features all at once. So our initial focus, instead of trying to go, to try to calibrate all 12 of those things right off the bat, is to start with a leaf area index calibration. And the reason we're doing that is because it's challenging, but we also think it's tractable. And also it's a foundational variable within CLM5 BGC, and I'll get to that in a second. And there's actually pretty good observational constraints. We've been observing LAI for a couple of decades now, so we have some reasonable observational constraints. So what is leaf area index? Just for anyone who doesn't know, it's the amount of leaf area per unit grid cell area. So this just shows you from the top down, if you're looking down from space, plant A, where you might have a leaf area that covers about 40% of the ground, that would have a leaf area of 0.4. The one on the right has a leaf area of 0.8. And if you have multiple layers of leaves, you can have numbers in excess of 1, which means, basically no light is getting through. And so a closed canopy forest, which might look something like this, might have a leaf area index of about 4, just to get you oriented. A grassland would be closer to 1 or 2. And it's an important variable because, it's correlated with a lot of environmental variables like photosynthesis and carbon uptake, fire emissions, latent heat flux, albedo, and is affected by water, drought, temperature, human management, CO2 concentration. So it's kind of a pretty synthesizing variable in the model. It's also a variable we got really wrong in CLM5. So that's another incentive to do it. So when we went through the selection process, we came up with this list of parameters. And what's nice about this list of parameters, and again, I'm not going to explain what each parameter is, but just to indicate that it kind of spans a bunch of different things, right? It's not all photosynthesis parameters. It's like some of them are photosynthesis parameters, some of them are hydrology parameters, plant water use, vegetation phenology, leaf physiology, respiration, allocation, nitrogen uptake, and snow. So it kind of spans the kind of things we think would be important for leaf area index. So that's kind of also comforting to see and also useful. The other thing I want to point out here is that several of these are PFT level parameters, which means that there's a different value for each of the 17 different plant functional types. And so we need to try to make a decision about how to handle that. And so we didn't want to, take this 23 parameters, and then if you added all the parameters that had some PFT variation, and then expanded by 17, you get end up with 200 parameters or something like that in your line hypercube. And again, you've gone too big. So we kind of limited to, we took 3 of these parameters. I can't remember which ones allowed it to be PFT varying. The other ones were sort of modifying up and down uniformly. End up with a situation we have 23 parameters, 3 PFT level, there were 32 effective parameters. We had a clever way to reduce that 17 down to 3. Times a 15 inflation factor for Latin hypercube, so 500 simulations. So a tractable number of simulations to run. Another unique thing about land models is that the land is not in equilibrium with the current climate state, and the vegetation is not in equilibrium with the current climate state. So if you ran to equilibrium at present day, you'd probably be about 10 to 15 to 20% higher at everything. More carbon stored on land, more leaf area index. So we didn't want to have to account for that in our calibration. So we ran every one of these what we call transient. So we ran that from 1850 up to present day, in addition to the spin up. So just another unique complication. And I guess I'm kind of getting, as you kind of see as I'm going through this, I'm getting to the point that you can bring data science to these problems, but if you don't have domain specialists, it's impossible. So it really has to be a two-way interaction, right? A domain specialist would never know this off the top of their head, right? They would never know that you need to take this extra step. Okay, just if you look, we ran those 500 simulations and looked at a really key variable in the land, which is the net cumulative carbon on land over the historical period. And so the way this looks in most Earth system models that are doing it close to right is that you've been losing carbon on land up until about 1950 to 1970. And that's due to land use change. All the cutting down of forests that we've done and harvesting wood out of forests has led to a loss of carbon on land. But in the last 50 years or so, carbon has been starting to come back on land, and that's due to the CO2 fertilization effect, which is masking some of the deforestation which is still going on. So overall, the net effect ends up being pretty close to 0 over the historical period on land. And what this just shows, if you just ran all those parameter sets and calculated that value, we see this massive range, right? Assuming all those parameter sets were equally valid, which of course not all of them are. But this is the range. This is actually a range that's in excess of the range from the CLM6 model. Okay, so then in the step of calibration, we're now at the point we've ran a Latin hypercube. We can identify metrics and do ML emulation. And I'm going to put this slide up here cautiously because I don't personally understand, emulation algorithms. But just to say that, Katie and Linear are testing different emulators and finding that not every emulator is created the same. This is probably totally not news to you here, but I was a little bit surprised by this. Some of these emulators are like performing really, really poorly. Some of them are performing, reasonably well. So this is part of the experience that we need to develop, and I guess GIS has gone through this as well. We can hopefully learn from them. But not all emulators are created the same. So that's step one. But once you do have an emulator that's reasonable, you can then ask questions about nonlinear interactions across your parameters. And this just shows two plots that kind of indicate that. This shows the maximum plant conductance versus leaf area index. And so you see there's some nonlinear relationship, which is sort of what you expect and almost kind of hope for to see out of the results. And then on the right is showing maximum plant conductance versus the leaf carbon to nitrogen ratio, and the contours of the leaf area index. And again, you see that there's not, there's a relationship between the two, as you have increase in leaf carbon to nitrogen ratios, you have lower leaf area, as you increase in max plant conductance, which means water can be used more efficiently, you have an increase in leaf area, and those two things are offsetting, competing with each other. Okay, so we can learn about that. And then I want to sort of finish for the last few minutes here about some of the challenges we're uncovering as we're trying to get towards calibration. And the news is we don't have calibration yet, in case anyone's wondering, but we're getting closer. There are challenges that you probably have thought about if you've been involved in calibration. The equifinality challenge is always going to be there. Many different parameter sets are likely going to give you a reasonable answer, and you have to cope with that. Multiple targets is challenging. Multiple variables, multiple different timescales. It's hard to get multiple things to work right in the model. The regionality problem, which I mentioned a few times before, that essentially that's tied into the plant functional type problem. And then also you have structural errors in your model, which is going to make it, in a lot of cases, like impossible. There's no way to get there. Okay, so let's just ask the question. Can we resolve the global bias in LAI? So it turns out CLM was producing LAI that was almost factor 2 too high. So global mean values of 2, and the actual global observations indicated should be about 1. So my hypothesis is that because we were hand tuning the model and we were trying to avoid this plants dying in pre-industrial conditions, we were like, not intentionally leading, pushing ourselves towards the model to be overproductive, to sort of compensate for that problem in 1850. So we weren't smart enough to figure out how to come up with a parameter set that would work. But if you just take a simple thing, can we get to a leaf area index of 1 and don't even do any emulation, just go look at your 500 simulations, take the one with the minimum error, we can find out that yes, we have a version that can match LAI globally. Exactly, perfect. We're good, we're done, right? That's no problem, that was easy. And this is what the parameter set looks like. Again, almost 30 parameters here, and they're normalized value. LAI is exactly 1.03, which is like exactly what the observations say they are. If you look at it, it kind of makes sense, which is also encouraging that this F-root leaf is a allocation parameter, which basically says put more of your carbon that you get into roots rather than leaves. And so if you do that, you're going to get more carbon underground, which means small leaf area. That makes sense. Leaf longevity is another parameter. So we're basically saying all our leaves are just turning over all the time. It's like constantly growing, dying, growing, dying, growing, dying. So, here's a parameter set which will give you global LAI. But here's also another parameter set. Again, not emulated or anything, just saying the closest one, bias is exactly 0, almost exactly 0 again. Exactly, totally, completely different values. Nothing even looks quasi-similar. Okay, this is not going to be surprising to anyone probably, but it's, obviously you have to be careful that you're going to have an equifinality problem. If we do try to do that calibration, this is the default bias out of CLM. Then we just say, let's actually do emulate and build a cost function and calibrate for the minimum error in the global mean LAI. This is what you get. So the global mean LAI in this case is almost 0. But what you see is all we've done is we've like cranked it up in the tropics and we've killed everything off in the boreal. So that's obviously not a viable model. If you calibrate for the minimum error in just the tropical forest LAI, that actually does a little bit better. You're getting a reasonable LAI in the tropical forest region, but now your parameters are not giving you good values in the mid-latitude. So that's another problem you have to handle. And then say if you want to try to calibrate, in different parts of the world and also for different variables. Here's an example. This is my last slide, basically last science slide. So this is what shows here is 3 different regions: tropical rainforest, temperate seasonal forest, and temperate grassland. And the circle and the green dot is probably a lot easier to see there is the observational value for GPP versus LEI and some uncertainty estimate. And so what you see here is that a few things. One you see is that, it looks like, and these are all the different values from the perturbed parameter experiment, the Latin hypercube. Doesn't seem like we have a lot of overlap, which is unfortunate. We do have some overlap with the temperate seasonal forest. It's not great for the temperate grassland. If you do try to calibrate on the temperate seasonal forest, which seems the most promising, so you take, these are the points that, or the parameter sets, which more look like the most reasonable. If you look at where those parameter sets line up on for the tropical rainforest, perhaps surprisingly, it's totally like not going to give you a good value. Same thing for the temperate grassland. So again, these are probably not like super surprising, but you have to go through these steps to understand what are the targets, what are the metrics, what are the cost functions you need to build to sort of constrain your model. Okay, so that's where we're at. So Lenny is making good progress. I think we're going to get there, hopefully. But the idea is I think the really important thing here is the repeatableness of it. Everything we're doing it carefully, building the tool that runs so that anybody can run it. We're checking if somebody else can run it. We've come up with a fast model. We got a set of observations. We have sound numerical methods and parameter priors, automated workflows, which leads to parameter and model insights, quick, repeatable, and transparent. That's really the idea here. I think if we don't do this, we don't want to do another one-off paper where we write, here we've calibrated the model and then never do it again, right? This is what we expect to do like routinely going forward once we get to this. So I'm just going to finish there and summarize and say, systematic model calibration obviously is really important to climate model development. It's been hindered by a variety of challenges, computational power, and a lot of the challenges I talked about today. But we're kind of getting around, we have a few examples now where people are getting to the point where you might be able to do global parameter calibration. Land models in particular have their own set of problems. The very large parametric space and the structural uncertainties, which impacts the assessment of emergent climate features such as land carbon sink or hydrologic sensitivity. So we need to do this if we want to have better estimation, but it's a challenging problem. Machine learning emulation can help us optimize resources and reduce subjectivity in model calibration. The CLM 5 PP community data sets are resulting in many offshoot projects will be publicly available soon, and already a lot of people are using them. People have access to Cheyenne. I'd like to put them on the Leap Jupyter Hub. And we're making progress towards open source model calibration tools. And our real goal is striving towards some level of land model calibration for CSM3, which we're targeting. CSM3 is targeted for fall 2024, is what we're talking about now. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Any questions? Maybe we can also start with the early and begin. Sorry, Marcus. No worries. Just in junior, come on.
Really interesting. I'm wondering if you've thought at all about how these PPEs can give you some insights into largest priority structural errors to look at.
Yeah. Well, I think we had an example there just right there at the end that seeing situations where we do not have a parameter in our parameter space, which is going to get us into the reasonable range. We only just started looking at that. This was sort of the first results like that, but it would be interesting to do a systematic sweep of all the climate variables and see how often we just essentially have nothing in our Latin hypercube, which can get us into the space. And then once you've gotten to there, then I'm not sure what you do exactly. I'd have to think that one through. I've not thought that through yet, but definitely that's the kind of thing that I just say that this is the first time that we have done like a full parameter sweep of the model. You would think that by now we would have done it, but we haven't. And part of it was because over 100 of the parameters were not even exposed. So we couldn't even do this thing. So I had to go through that. You had to say, we're going to bite the bullet. We're going to spend 6 months finding all the parameters, pulling them out. And so I'm guessing a lot of groups around the world are also just be like, it's too much work. But we're finding we're really glad that we did it. Right. And so now it's the rule, right? If you're putting in a new parameterization, you've got to obviously put in the exposed parameter. So I feel like we're just at the beginning of how we're understanding how we're going to use this. It's a good question though.
There's one question online.
Yeah. Oh, can I see it?
Hi.
You're gonna pull that?
Can you hear me?
Are you online?
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me ask my question now?
In the meantime, I'll ask sort of question. So, by the way, has anyone done a time series analysis on this light and why it's random, or is
It felt like something related to me, but I don't think it was.
Yes.
Oh yeah. So a lot of the things that you're going through, of course, we've gone through, as you might imagine. Some of the decisions that we've made are the same. You know, like things like where we have that structural mismatch, we've had to deal with that sort of issue in the sort of space of the outputs and constructing the likelihood. But other things like for parameters that are less or more sensitive, we made like different decisions, right? So we just did everything. And there's certain reasoning behind that, but I think in general, like what we don't have, and what I'm really interested in, is sort of construction of, and it might be motivated that I'm reading this paper on Bayesian workflow, but there's sort of a workflow for this sort of climate model tuning that's very specific to our field, our sort of problems. So yeah, that's not really a question, is it? Anyway, it'll be fascinating to see like the decisions you make, and be nice to have these conversations also.
Yeah, I mean, that's where we're trying to push towards, right? Is that the gain knowledge from you guys, and hopefully you'll gain some knowledge from us too. I think that's where to be successful, we have to learn from each other. Otherwise, then why do we have to have lead? I completely agree. So just so you know, so you guys know, we are having a cross-working group session, the CSM workshop on parameter estimation, which means the atmosphere group and the land group are the ones two most active will be there. And there's remote participation. So hopefully you guys can make it, or obviously everyone's welcome to come to the CSM workshop. It's a fun meeting, but
also,
it's that
they'll be online also.
It'll be online, it'll be hybrid. Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. That was great. I know exponentially more about land models now than I knew before. That's not. So it's my philosophical question / scientific. So I mean, you mentioned, of course, it's super hard, right, to calibrate a model when you have so many parameters, and you can end up in a space where you have two completely different runs with really reduced bias and completely different parameters.
Right.
Some groups have adopted different strategies, which is rather than looking for the best set of parameters, roll out as many as you can. Is that the strategy that you've been thinking about for land or in general? And do you think it's valuable? Or
Yeah. I mean, I put that. I think why Daniel and Katie and Linnea put that example up because it's so stark and really captures people's attention. But obviously, we would never like consider either of those parameter sets to be realistic parameter sets. But yeah, no, I think that's what we're trying to do, and I think that's also what Marcus is trying to do is throw out some parts of the domain that's completely unreasonable. And we are not going to get to one parameter set that's gonna work. And I think one of the things we'd like to do is constrain it down to 100 parameter sets that we think are reasonable, doing as good as we can for a range of variables, and then in land only mode at least, run that through the full carbon cycle trajectory out into the future and see what the range is, right? I think that even that would be an interesting result. Ideally, we would get to the point where, and I think Gis is talking about doing this too, is trying to run with multiple parameter sets within a CMIP context, right? And that would be cool, right? That's never been done. So yeah, run with it has to be modest, right? Maybe 4 or 5 parameter sets. that you like, and at least have some sort of parametric uncertainty within the model. But yeah, there's no one answer. Obviously, we know that that's 100%. The challenge with doing that with that idea is, at least in our model, you have to spin each version up. And that's hard. We don't, so there's another thing, like we should probably spend the time to really automate the full process. But the reason spin up is hard is it has to be iterative. And so you got to run the full system, archive some information for the force to land in the ocean, then run them for a long period of time, then do it again and again until everything comes to equilibrium. And so right now it's a human, there needs to be a human in the loop currently, which anytime you have to have a human in the loop, you can like throw it away.
We have a question from Tom. He says, thanks for a great talk. This might be a naive question, but why must you start your spin-ups from scratch each time? Why can't you instead start from known equilibrium solutions from older models to start from, or maybe solutions for simpler models that have some of the faster timescales removed?
So we actually do. I didn't really say that. We don't start from, we have a situation we call cold start. Cold start is when you don't have any information, you have a brand new model and you just give it some like quasi-random, not random, but some human decided initial condition values for a bunch of different pools. And we often, when we have a brand new model, start with that. But every time after we've got a simulation that works, then we always just interpolate our initial conditions. So the answer to that is that we do, and that will reduce the time scale spin up, and that's actually accounted for in this here. I didn't really explain it completely. Simpler analytical solutions from some model could work, or you could possibly try to, if you had observational estimates of your soil carbon states and your vegetation carbon states, you could potentially try to spin it up. But our experience has been that you don't, A, it doesn't really work that well, and B, you don't really save much time, because there's always, the challenge with the spin up is actually another one is that, some relatively significant fraction of good cells spin up really fast, especially in the tropics. Turnover is really fast, it'll spin up in 100 years. But in the high latitudes in the permafrost, it can take thousands of years. And so, and some good cells will never spin up. We actually have a criteria to say we assume that 5% are never going to come to equilibrium for reasons that we've never really fully understood. I think it's related to fire. But so anyway, so we've gone through this art for a long time. I guess it's an art. The spin up process is an art. There is no one solution, and we have our process now. But yeah, you could have a big research project to come up with a better spin-up method. And that's what they did in Northern Arizona. And it is accelerated by 10 times. That's good.
I have two questions. First is I was wondering, so one at a time experiment has been done. I wonder if like two at a time has been done. So compare that with one at a time perturbation to see if parameter interaction really matters. And the other question is, when you estimate the parameters, it seems like it's almost certain that the optimum solution has been more than one, right? So I was wondering, have you like run into like biomodal or like multimodal like estimations, or can that be as a sign to show, oh, it's really revealing some more complicated structure in the emulator?
Yeah. So we have not done it two at a time, but we did within the hypercube, right? We ran with 30 some parameters, and we could look at parameter interaction effects. And Linnea has a method that she can break it down. You'd have to get her to come here and explain. And what we're finding is that there are parameter interactions as you would expect, but we're kind of lucky that they're not huge in the land model. Actually, they're not like, it's not like 50% is a parameter interaction effect. It's more at the 15 to 20% range, which means we're not like in a super nonlinear space a lot of the time. And then you're right, there could be multiple modes. And I think that's, I'm not sure we're far enough along to know really how often we're going to encounter the multiple locations where you find a good parameter set. But we anticipate we will find that. The question, of course, and I am curious to talk with learning the GIST experience more, is that as you do try to calibrate with more and more variables and more metrics, you should have fewer places where there's actually reasonable parameter sets, is what I would guess. Or the other alternative is you can't find any parameter sets that actually give you anything that's better than the control. I guess that could be a possibility too. But we haven't gotten that far yet.
Hey, this was great. So just in addressing what you had just brought up, we did think we'd have fewer parameter formations, but it turns out that when we put observational error, then that opened up the plausibility or the state space for plausible parameter combinations. So that was kind of counteracted the use of more metrics. But I had a couple of questions. So so you had lots of parameters that you removed. I guess it was like 140. So do you think any of those might have mattered if the default settings for the other parameters that you retained were changed, to address a different state?
Yeah. We can't answer that question with what we've done so far, but yeah, you could totally imagine that some of them would matter. We're also using expert judgment here, which I didn't really say, which is that, you look at the parameter list and we looked like, is there a parameter that we kind of thought was going to matter that's not in here? And in fact, we added one parameter, I think. It was an expert judgment parameter. We just said, we're really surprised this parameter doesn't matter, and we're kind of concerned about not having it in our set. I don't know how you would really do that without a lot of computational time to figure that out. But this was, we selected those parameters just for leaf area index. Now, if we go to multiple variables, we would have to redo that exercise. And at some point, you're going to find out that you're going to need, 50, 100, 200 parameters. I mean, actually, I do feel like we're going to find out about 100 of those parameters essentially just don't matter much in almost any condition that we feel like we're going to calibrate for.
Yeah, it's funny because we have 36 apples and ours, and when we got to the 36, which was tropical cyclone count, one parameter that never mattered at all mattered.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So it's like, so there's two more questions because I'm actually really curious. So the spin-up, we're running into these issues with spin-up because we have the IS 4 configurations. It took 2 years to get 2 of those to work with in full ESM. 2 of them never did work with the rest of the model. Threw those out. But I wish we were able to learn this more quickly. What wouldn't and what would not work. And so my question was, do you know if your early results, or when you were doing spin up, were predictive of the final results after you would have reached spin up, where you could sort of use some information, and it wouldn't be realistic, of course, but like some sort of prediction mapping from these to final results?
I think that that's a step that we're planning to take, right? I mean, we haven't done this where you take your optimized parameter set and run them back through the model to ensure that it gives you a reasonable result. So we can. It's a little easier in the land world because we can do it all in land only mode. And if it works in land only mode, which is cheap and fast, it's unlikely it's going to screw up the coupled model enough to make it not a viable model. So I think we're a little bit lucky in that.
And then my final thing, which was really interesting. So when you plot up that scatter plot, or when you show the scatter plot of the Latin hypercube samples, when we Marcus ran the MCMC on the emulator, we ended up with a new cluster of points that actually were separated from the scatter plot. So it was sort of looked like it was outside the training. It was interesting. Now, who knows why that arose? It could have been because the emulator was in error, but that new cluster was actually good. And we ended up in a state space that was not in the whole entire Latin hypercube, but that was one of our actually official CMF6 submissions.
Yeah, interesting. We'll have to keep our eye out for that. That'd be interesting if we get that same result.
Yeah, one of the things that always surprised me about reference models is the fact that we're trying to do so many things at the same time, right? And in the ocean side, for example, there was some work at JPL, maybe 10 years ago, but they showed that you could build a very reduced form ecological model that would give you a reasonable simulation of the carbon cycle, even though it wouldn't give you maybe all the output that you needed to predict fisheries or other things like that, right? So I guess one of the challenges you're also dealing with is the fact that you're trying to so many things all at once, right? But if you only cared about the land carbon sink, for example, or something, I don't know what, or where the trees are, or something like that, for the grasslands, would there be a more reduced form version of the model that would be useful and that would be worth working on? Or how much could you go between reduced complexity to the full complexity in this process? And I don't know if that's a very good question, but.
No, it's an interesting question. It's, it's the kind of question that comes up like, why are you doing all that stuff? I think it's a hard question to answer, right? That I have a cop-out answer, which is that if somebody wants to do that, to do swarm model, in a university setting, that's like totally appropriate. And they should go ahead and do it. And that at NCAR and the other major system modeling centers, we're the only groups that can really handle the complexity. And so then we are going to spend our time in complexity. It's not a super satisfying answer, but that's the way I just look at it, because I can't also think about building reduced form models. And so, but yeah, it's totally a reasonable question. And there is, I should say that there's a model called Cardamom, which is a pretty simple model. I think I'm not sure if they're using some form of it in the CLIMA project, but it's got a really limited number of sets of parameters, and it's easily to manipulate. So they just go through, they do like all this, they just get away with it. They just run huge ensembles, and it runs really fast, and it takes, it runs on monthly time scale. And so it does kind of exist. And you can imagine situations where you kind of couple our two efforts together, given enough money and resources.
Hi, Dave. I'm wondering, so all the PPE analysis you've done is based on the statistical analogy. And in this case, you said like we can put the globe at 400 grid cells. They are kind of column models. The interaction between the columns do not matter so much. But I think if you consider using BGC later, will the interaction between grid cells matter? The second question is, why will you? Because the same question is, because I think you should have runoff, snow melt something, those mechanisms in the model. So but for satellite technology, these things do not matter for satellite technology?
Yeah. So first of all, to clarify, the first project we did that was led by Kate Dagon back in 2020 was with satellite technology, but everything since then we've been running with BGC, which is the big step forward that we've made. Is that I think the first group that's really ever tried to do the land model with a full BGC model. And with the BGC, there's no more interactions good cell to good cell with BGC than there is in the satellite technology mode. And really the only interactions there would be in the real world are lateral flow of water and potentially lateral flow of heat, but that probably doesn't matter on the scales that we're working on. So there could be some lateral flow of water. Our thinking is that the scales we're running at, it's more than our thinking, it's really the scales we're running at, it's redistribution within a grid cell, that's what matters. And I could give a whole nother talk about how we're trying to deal with redistribution of water within a grid cell. We have this thing called the representative whole cell model, which wasn't part of this because it's a next generation complexity model, but we do account for that. In terms of vegetation, the only way that it really matters is seed dispersal and potentially fire could move from grid cell to grid cell. And again, in our most advanced version of the model, which is not the one I'm showing here, those things are being kind of considered. But if we get to that stage and we have to deal with that and calibrate the model, it's like all bets are off. So we'll see. Right now, we can't get a global configuration that's really working on that more complex model, but it's where we're going. Hopefully that answers the question.
That's a quick, that's great. So going back to the scale of, so I think it was interesting because the observation for you was like one dot, right?
Yeah.
But you could say, I mean, we have huge uncertainties as well because LAI is actually quite complex. I mean, you could even talk about like clumping and all of that mess, where, it can be very difficult to get LAI, right? And so we don't really know whether that's true. And then what it means is that kind of the observations becomes really a bottleneck in the analysis, like getting the absolute value could be really, really complex, whereas maybe looking at the spatial and temporal variation might be an easier task, and maybe that fits the model better in a sense, because I remember at the time there were discussions about, some moisture in the model that people say, oh, that's your model, some moisture, but it doesn't match that model, some moisture, it doesn't match real world, some moisture, but as long as it regulates things that are important to you, maybe that's okay, like as long as you get the spatial and temporal variability. And
yeah,
just would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, 100%. That's really where we're heading. And right now, I feel like we're building in workflows and processes. Your cost function. Once you got yourself an ability to, have a cost function and then calibrate towards it, then you can switch out that cost function and make it anything. And so we're just trying to build a skill set, which some other groups already have, and demonstrate that we can do what we think, do it right and do it. But then, then the big, actually, one of the most interesting parts of this is going to be deciding what is your metric or set of metrics. And totally, we are actually thinking about trends in LAI, seasonal cycle of LAI. It's actually the max LAI, which we're looking at here, annual max, because annual means kind of a weird variable for LAI. So all those kind of things that we're thinking about. And then for every variable, you're going to have to decide what are the observations really can tell you, right? A lot of the data sets don't really provide good interannual variability, but they provide seasonal. Some data sets have gyrocycle. So that's going to be where the fun is going to be. And that's going to be art, because there's going to be no one answer, I think. I don't think. I don't know how you can do it systematically.
Thanks so much. So let's thank
Thank you.
Jane again.